in the parched heart of South Sudan, where the earth cracks like a broken promise and the horizon is often blurred by the dust of displacement. Hope is not found in grand speeches. It is found in the rhythmic footfalls of a woman walking into the heat. They say that when the world turns its back, a nurse turns toward the pain. This is the story of Maria, a woman who owned nothing but a white uniform and a spirit that refused to be silenced by the sound of gunfire. It is the story of a Korean giant who had everything the world could offer, yet found his soul's purpose in a mud-slicked thicket during the darkest 3 days of his life. This is a journey of the Maria Mile, the distance where medicine ends and humanity begins. The story follows Maria, a dedicated South Sudanese nurse in Malakal who treats humanity as her only currency, even when her salary is non-existent. Her world is transformed when Ji-Hoon, a wealthy and powerful man from South Korea, arrives on a mission of logistics, but stays for a mission of the heart. Together, they face the grueling reality of a health center running on prayers and grit. The conflict, a terrifying escape into the bush, surviving 3 days of relentless rain and rebel threats. A love forged in the shadow of life and death, proving that the greatest bridge between nations is the touch of a healing hand. Before we begin, it is important to note that the characters of Maria and Ji-Hoon and the specific events of their romance are works of fiction. However, while the characters are imagined, the ground reality is not. This story is deeply rooted in the actual conditions of South Sudan, a nation of immense beauty and strength that continues to navigate the challenges of conflict, healthcare scarcity, and the desperate need for international solidarity. This is a tribute to the real-life heroes who walk those dusty paths as every day, long after the cameras are turned off. Let us step into their world. The dust of the Upper Nile does not merely settle. It clings, it coats the throat, stains the hem of a white uniform, and carries the scent of iron and parched earth. For Maria, this dust is the fabric of her daily bread. Her story begins not in a sterile clinic with humming air conditioners, but on the footpaths of the Jonglei state, where the sun feels less like a light and more like a weight. Maria is a woman whose beauty is found in the calluses of her hands and the unwavering steadying of her voice. As a nurse, her office has no walls. It is the shade of a Balanite's tree. It is the cramped interior of a mud-walled tukul. It is the middle of a dirt track where a mother has collapsed from exhaustion. While others might see a village broken by the scars of conflict, Maria sees a map of humanity waiting to be mended. She is known for the Maria Mile. That extra distance she walks after her shift is technically over, heading toward the distant plumes of cooking smoke. Are too frail to reach the central camp. When the calls for help echoed from the displacement camps in Malakal, Maria didn't ask about the logistics or the risk. She simply packed her kit. In Malakal, hospital is often just a word for a collection of tents and the tireless spirits within them. The reality of South Sudan is etched into the faces she greets. Children whose eyes are too large for their faces. Families carrying their entire lives in a single plastic bundle. The heavy quiet that follows a night of distant gunfire. There's no payday in the traditional sense, in a land where the economy has been fractured by years of struggle. Maria's salary is often delayed, or so meager it barely covers her own grain. In a world obsessed with accumulation, Maria is a radical anomaly. She is a woman who has found a way to thrive on the currency of grace. To see Maria at the end of a 16-hour day is to witness a miracle of the human spirit. Her uniform is grayed by the road, her feet are swollen, and her pockets are empty. Yet, as she sits by a small fire, sharing a cup of water with a stranger, she radiates a joy that feels defiant. Her happiness is not born of ignorance, but of purpose. She is happy because she knows the exact weight of a child who has finally begun to gain grams of health. She has seen the light return to the eyes of a soldier who realized he was being treated as a human, not a casualty. She understands that while war can take a home, it cannot take the dignity of a woman who chooses to stay and heal. They call her Maria in the local dialects. Her name has become a synonym for arrival. When the villagers see the tall, slender silhouette of a woman in a nurse's cap cresting the hill, they don't say the medic is here. They say Maria has come. She is the heartbeat of a nation that refuses to stop pulsing. She is the proof that even when the coffers are empty and the guns are loud, the most powerful force in South Sudan isn't the gold or the oil, it is the woman who walks 10 miles just to hold a shaking hand and say, "I am here, and you are not forgotten." The arrival of the international delegation was like a sudden storm of polished chrome and bright colors against the muted, dusty landscape of the Malakal Health Center. Among the team of American and Korean officials was Ji-Hoon, a man who seemed to have been carved out of granite. Standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders that blocked out the sun as he stepped off the transport, he was a giant of industry and influence. He had come to inspect medical equipment logistics, but he was not prepared for the reality of the front lines. As the delegation moved through the facility, the air became heavy with the weight of the struggle. The delegation fanned themselves, visibly shaken by the 104 degrees Fahrenheit heat trapped under the corrugated metal roofs. Ji-Hoon watched as 3 nurses shared a single pair of latex gloves, washing them in a basin to reuse them. A sight that made his heart tighten. Despite the lack of resources, the clinic was a whirlwind of motion. Mothers with infants stood in lines that stretched into the dust, their eyes fixed on the one person who seemed to be the center of the universe. Ji-Hoon first saw Maria while she was kneeling in the dirt. She was tending to an elderly man with a leg wound, her white uniform stained at the knees, her face glowing with a layer of perspiration that looked like liquid silver in the sun. She didn't look up when the important visitors walked by. She didn't adjust her hair or try to hide the meager supplies she was using. She simply kept whispering to her patient in a voice so steady it seemed to quiet the chaos of the camp. When she finally stood and met Ji-Hoon's gaze, the contrast was staggering. He was a man of cold statistics and massive steel structures. She was a woman of warm blood and fragile bandages. In her eyes, he didn't see the exhaustion he expected. He saw a ferocious joy. The delegation leader called for the team to return to the vehicles, but Ji-Hoon didn't move. He felt a pull in his chest that no corporate success had ever provided. He saw the way Maria's hands, small but incredibly strong, held the weight of her community. "The equipment can be sent," Ji-Hoon said, his voice deep and resonant, startling his colleagues. But the equipment needs a heart to run it. I am staying. He walked toward Maria, his massive frame towering over her, yet he approached with the humility of a student. You have been fighting this war with nothing but your spirit, he told her, his eyes locking onto hers. I have the resources of the world behind me. From today, you and I are going to work together. We are going to change the rhythm of this place. The atmosphere at the health center shifted instantly. It was the beginning of an unlikely alliance, the giant from the east and the angel of the south. Ji-Hoon didn't just provide funds. He rolled up his sleeves, he moved heavy crates of medicine, he built sturdy frames for recovery beds, and he followed Maria's lead through the affected villages. The love in this story wasn't the easy, cinematic kind. It was a love forged in the fire of shared labor. It was found in the quiet moments at midnight when they shared a single flashlight to check on a feverish child. Maria taught him that humanity isn't found in a bank account, but in the extra mile. In return, Ji-Hoon gave Maria the one thing she never thought she'd have: a partner who was strong enough to help her carry the weight of a nation. The bond between Maria and Ji-Hoon grew not in the comfort of a city, but in the grueling miles they walked together across the floodplains and dusty tracks of South Sudan. As they moved, the physical distance between them closed, replaced by a silent, powerful understanding. A frantic message arrived at dusk. A woman in a remote village across the seasonal marsh was in obstructed labor. With no vehicles able to navigate the mud, Maria grabbed her medical bag. Without a word, Ji-Hoon shouldered the heavy oxygen concentrator and the emergency kit. They walked for 4 hours through waist-deep water. When Maria tripped on a submerged root, Ji-Hoon's massive hand caught her instantly, pulling her against his chest to steady her. For a moment, the sound of the frogs and the distant war vanished. He didn't let go until he was sure she was safe. As they reached the village and successfully delivered a healthy baby boy, Maria looked up to see Ji-Hoon, a man used to boardrooms, cradling the infant with tears in his eyes. In that moment of shared exhaustion and victory, she realized he wasn't just a donor, he was her partner. While trekking to a distant vaccination point, a sudden, blinding haboob dust storm swept across the plains. The wind was so violent, it threatened to tear the medical supplies from their hands. Ji-Hoon used his massive frame as a human shield, pushing Maria against the leeward side of a large rock and covering both her and the medicine coolers with his heavy canvas coat. They were pressed heart to heart in the dark, cramped space, the roar of the wind deafening outside. To keep her calm, Ji-Hoon spoke softly in Korean, his deep voice vibrating through his chest against her shoulder. Maria didn't understand the words, but she understood the soul behind them. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers disappearing into his palm. When the storm cleared, they emerged covered in the same red dust, looking at each other with a new, quiet intensity. The Korean giant was no longer a stranger from across the world. He was her protector. They arrived at a settlement only to find the community suffering from severe dehydration because the local pump had broken. The medical crisis wasn't a virus, it was thirst. While Maria treated the dehydrated elders with oral rehydration salts, Ji-Hoon spent 6 hours in the blistering sun using his strength to strip down and repair the rusted iron pump. Maria watched him work until his shirt was soaked and his knuckles were bleeding. When the first gush of cool water finally sprayed out, the village cheered. Maria walked over to him, took a wet cloth, and gently wiped the grease and sweat from his forehead. As her hand lingered on his face, Ji-Hoon leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. "You save their souls, Maria," he whispered. "I just want to make sure the world is strong enough to hold you while you do it." In that moment, under the scorching South Sudanese sun, the twist of love became a reality. A nurse who gave everything and a giant who had finally found something worth protecting. The arrival of the Korean giant did not just bring money. It brought a seismic shift to the very air of the Malakal clinic. Before Ji-Hoon, the facility was a place of making do, where nurses like Maria used sunlight because there was no fuel for lamps, and where the pharmacy was often just a few half-empty boxes on a dirt floor. As a man of immense wealth and industrial logic, Ji-Hoon didn't just write checks, he re-engineered the environment. Within weeks, the clinic began to breathe again. He installed high-grade solar arrays. For the first time, the clinic didn't go dark at 6 p.m. The sight of a bright white light shining in the middle of the dark South Sudanese night became a beacon of hope for miles. He flew in specialized drilling equipment to create a deep-bore well. Now Maria didn't have to choose between washing her hands and giving a patient a drink. Clean, cool water flowed from taps, reducing the cholera risk that haunts the camps in 2026. In South Sudan's 40 degrees Celsius heat, medicine spoils in hours. Ji-Hoon brought in medical-grade refrigerators, ensuring that the vaccines Maria carried on her long walks were actually potent enough to save lives. He moved through the wards like a quiet titan, his massive silhouette a constant presence behind Maria. He was the steel to her soul. The tension between them reached a breaking point one evening during the lean season of 2026. When the rains had turned the roads into impassable rivers of mud. The clinic was overflowing with families displaced by localized skirmishes. Maria was exhausted. She had been on her feet for 20 hours, her spirit flagging under the sheer weight of the suffering. She was in the small, newly lit supply room, reaching for a heavy crate of 4 fluids on a high shelf. Her hands, usually so steady, began to shake. Her knees buckled just as the crate slipped. Before the crate could hit the floor, a pair of massive, scarred hands reached over her head and caught the weight. Ji-Hoon was standing directly behind her, his chest a solid wall against her back. He didn't just take the crate. He kept his arms extended, effectively caging her against the shelf in a protective embrace. For a long, breathless minute, neither moved. Maria could feel the heat radiating from him, the scent of expensive soap mixed with the iron smell of the South Sudanese dust. For the first time in years, she felt small, not in a way that diminished her, but in a way that allowed her to finally let go of the burden of being the strong one. Ji-Hoon leaned down, his breath warm against the side of her neck. His hand moved from the shelf to tentatively brush the hair away from her tired face. It was an invitation, a silent question from a man who had everything but had found his only treasure in a dusty nurse. Maria's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She leaned back into him for a second, closing her eyes, savoring the feeling of being protected. The reality of South Sudan, the lack of doctors, the ongoing conflict, the sacred duty she held rushed back. She was not just a woman, she was a lifeline. She gently placed her hands over his massive ones and slowly turned around. Her eyes were shimmering with a mix of affection and sorrow. She stepped back, creating a sliver of space that felt like a canyon. "Ji-Hoon," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "The world is still breaking outside that door. If I fall into you, I might never want to get back up. And they need me to stand." Hoon looked at his empty hands, then at her. He didn't push. He simply nodded, his face tight with a love that was willing to wait. He stepped aside to let her pass, but as she walked away, he reached out and caught her sleeve for one last second. "I am not going anywhere, Maria," he said in his deep, resonant tone. "If you have to stand for them, then I will be the ground beneath your feet." They returned to the ward, working side by side in the bright solar light. Two souls bound by a humanity that was more powerful than the war outside. The peace of the solar-lit clinic was shattered not by a storm, but by the rhythmic, terrifying thud-thud of heavy-caliber gunfire. The 2026 conflict had reached their gates. In South Sudan, war doesn't give you time to pack. As the rebels descended on Malakal, the air filled with the acrid smell of smoke and the screams of the displaced. Maria, acting on pure instinct, grabbed a single bag of trauma supplies, while Ji-Hoon, using his massive strength, literally scooped up two elderly patients and carried them toward the tree line. They ran until their lungs burned, disappearing into the dense, unforgiving brush of the sod. Behind them, the orange glow of the burning clinic, the sanctuary they had built, lit up the horizon like a funeral pyre. The sky turned a bruised purple and opened up. For 3 days, the rains were relentless. In the bush, the rain is not a cleansing force. It is a cold, soaking misery that turns the earth into a swamp. They huddled under a canopy of acacia trees. Maria was weird. Her eyes were vacant, her hands constantly moving as if she were still trying to dress wounds that weren't there. She was suffering from the trauma of seeing her life's work vanish in an hour. Ji-Hoon's physical strength began to fail him. The Korean giant was shivering, his expensive clothes shredded and caked in mud. He became silent, staring into the dark, realizing that all his billions couldn't buy a single dry match or a moment of safety. Fever set in for many of the survivors they were with. They were hungry, soaked to the bone, and the sound of distant patrols kept them in a state of vibrating terror. On the third night, hidden in a deep thicket, the cold became life-threatening. Maria and Ji-Hoon lay pressed together on a bed of damp leaves, trying to share what little body heat remained. The weirdness of the previous days melted into a raw, desperate clarity. In the middle of the night, with the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the leaves above, Maria turned her face toward his. In the darkness, her eyes found his. Two souls stripped of their titles, their money, and their clothes. They were just two humans who might not see the sunrise. It wasn't a cinematic kiss. It was desperate, tasting of salt, rain, and the metallic tong of fear. Ji-Hoon pulled her into him, his massive arms trembling as he held her. When his lips met hers, it wasn't about romance. It was an act of defiance against the death that sat in the bushes around them. It was a kiss that said, "I am still here. You are still here. We are alive." For those hours in the middle of the night, the war didn't exist. There was only the heat of their breath and the frantic beating of two hearts refusing to stop. They held each other with a fierce, painful intimacy, a clutching that was less about desire and more about the soul's refusal to be lonely at the end. As the gray light of the fourth morning broke through the mist, the sound of heavy engines replaced the rain. Panic flared until they saw the flags. The government military had pushed through the rebel lines. The rescue was a blur of shouting soldiers and the thrum of transport trucks. Maria and Ji-Hoon were helped onto a vehicle, their hands still locked together so tightly that the soldiers had to assist them as a single unit. They weren't taken back to the ruins of Malakal, but to the capital, Juba. As the truck rattled toward the city, the international giant and the Sudanese angel sat in the back, covered in the same red mud, looking at the horizon. When they finally arrived at a secure facility in the town, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, aching grief for what was lost, but also a new, unbreakable bond. Ji-Hoon looked at Maria, his face weary, but his eyes burning with a promise. "The clinic is gone," he whispered, his voice cracking. "But we are not. We will build it again. I didn't come here just for the humanity, Maria. I stayed for you." In the middle of a country torn by conflict, a love had been forged that was stronger than the steel Ji-Hoon used to build, and more resilient than the medicine Maria used to heal. They were no longer two people from different worlds. They were one story of survival. The recovery in Juba was not just physical. It was a period of silent, profound reconstruction of their spirits. In the quiet corridors of the hospital, away from the sounds of gunfire and the lashing rain of the bush, the international love story transitioned from a struggle for survival into a blueprint for a shared future. 2 weeks after their rescue, Maria and Ji-Hoon sat in a small, walled garden behind the recovery center. The sun was setting, casting a long, golden glow over the city, a stark contrast to the gray darkness of the Sud. Ji-Hoon looked different. The polished, corporate giant had been replaced by a man whose eyes held the depth of the earth. Maria, though still slender and soft-spoken, carried a new, iron-like stillness. "I have been speaking with my partners in Seoul," Ji-Hoon said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. "They want me to come home. They say South Sudan is too dangerous for a man of my position." Maria looked away, her heart tightening. She expected him to leave. In her world, people like Ji-Hoon often came to help, but they always eventually flew away when the reality became too heavy. "And?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Ji-Hoon reached out, his massive hand covering hers. "I told them I'm already home. Home isn't a building in Seoul anymore, Maria. Home is wherever you are standing." In that moment, the weirdness and the trauma of the bush were finally laid to rest. They began to plan, not as a donor and a nurse, but as a unit. They promised each other that they wouldn't just rebuild, they would innovate. Using Ji-Hoon's connections to the cutting-edge medical technology of South Korea, they envisioned a clinic that was bulletproof, solar-powered, and equipped with satellite telemedicine. "We will go back," Maria declared, her eyes flashing with the familiar fire. "But this time we won't just provide bandages. We will provide a future. You bring the steel and the science. I will bring the trust of my people. Ji-Hoon leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. No more walking alone, Maria. Every mile you walk into those villages, I walk beside you. My strength is yours. Because they had faced death together, their commitment to success was unbreakable. The new clinic, which the locals began to call the Gold and Green Center, representing the wealth of Korea and the growth of Sudan, became a marvel of modern humanity. Ji-Hoon shipped in prefabricated, reinforced medical pods from Korea. These were not tents. They were high-tech surgical suites that could withstand the harshest environments. Maria didn't just treat patients. She used the new facility to train a new generation of South Sudanese nurses, funded by Ji-Hoon's foundation. The clinic became a symbol of what happens when international wealth stops being charity and starts being partnership. As they stood together at the ribbon cutting of the new facility, the massive Korean man and the fearless Sudanese nurse were no longer anomalies. They were a legend. The intimacy that began in a mud-slicked thicket under the rain had blossomed into a powerhouse of change. They didn't just build a clinic, they built a bridge between two worlds. As they watched the first patients walk through the doors, Ji-Hoon didn't look at the building. He looked at Maria. The international love story was no longer about a giant and an angel. It was about two humans who realized that while one person can save a life, two people, bound by love and purpose, can save a nation. The legend of Maria and Ji-Hoon did not end with a building, but with a legacy that rippled across the White Nile. The Phoenix Clinic became more than a medical center. It became a sanctuary where the Maria Mile was taught to every new student, and where the Korean giant's strength was measured not by his wealth, but by the weight of the crates he still carried into the bush by her side. In the evenings, when the solar lights flicker on across the plains of Malakal, you can still see them two silhouettes, one towering and one steady, walking together toward the next village, proving that even in the most parched earth, love can find enough water to bloom. While the story of Maria and Ji-Hoon is a work of fiction, the heartbeat of this narrative is very much real. The challenges described, the displacement, the lack of medical infrastructure, the seasonal floods, and the immense bravery of local nurses are the daily realities for millions in South Sudan. Stories like this serve as a mirror to our world. They remind us that while the characters may be imagined, the need for humanity and international solidarity is urgent and tangible. South Sudan is a young nation with a resilient spirit, but it requires the world's attention. If this story touched your heart, here is how you can move from a viewer to a contributor. Organizations like Doctors Without Borders, MSF, the International Rescue Committee, IRC, and Water for South Sudan, WFS, work directly on the ground in South Sudan, providing the exact kind of life-saving care Maria provided in our story. Support initiatives that focus on training local medical professionals. True sustainability comes when the Marias of the world have the tools and training to lead their own communities. Stay informed about the regional situation. Awareness is the first step toward the political stability that allows clinics to stay open and families to stay home. Sometimes, contribution is as simple as sharing the story of South Sudan with others. In a world of loud headlines, the quiet struggle for health and dignity in East Africa often goes unheard. What part of Maria and Ji-Hoon's journey inspired you the most? Could you be the bridge someone else is waiting for?